March of the Machine has been fully spoiled. So we've seen every single card in the set, which means that, as per usual, we're going to look at what I believe is going to be the top 10 cards for Standard. So I'm going to say in advance, as per usual, this is going to be my opinion. So it's going to be what I believe are going to be the top 10 cards. And honestly, this set has a lot going on with it. So feel free to throw in the comments if there's anything you feel you disagree with, if there's cards you feel I leave out, or cards you feel that I put in the top 10 that shouldn't be. Because a lot of the things that are going on here, we've got some legendary creature matchup, like combinations. So just cards with a lot of text. We've got the battles, that is a completely new card type. And then we've got a lot of legendary creatures that have a transform effect that activates as a sorcery. And then the back side of these cards have a lot going on as well. So all in all, this set is very complex from the standpoint of really understanding how these cards are going to shape the meta or affect the meta at all. So I'm not going to lie, picking these top 10 was very, very hard, and I made some last minute changes. And honestly, this list changed a lot before I decided to record this video. So let's just go ahead and get started. For the first time, there's no rare land, so I'm just going to go straight to the top 10 cards itself. And at number 10, I'm not going to lie, my top 10, I'm going to be a little biased. Top 10 is probably what is going to be my favorite card coming out in this set, and that's Thalion the Gitrog Monster. It's for 1, a white, black, and a green, so white and Abzan, for legendary creature Human Frog Horror. It's a 4/4. It has First Strike and Death Touch. You may play an additional land on each of your turns. Creatures and non-basic lands your opponent control enter the battlefield tapped, and whenever Thalion the Gitrog Monster attacks, sacrifice a creature or land and draw a card. So like I said, this is a legendary creature matchup of Thalia and the Gitrog Monster, and it comes with a wall of text. So let's just dissect it here. It's a 4-mana 4/4, which is decent. First Strike and Death Touch means that in combat it's fantastic. It's going to be very hard for your opponent to deal with. Great against aggro, especially that it has 4 toughness. It doesn't die to like lightning bolts or lightning strikes, strangles, that kind of stuff. It's nice that you can play an additional land on each of your turn. It slows your opponent down a lot. If your creatures are entering tapped, their non-basic lands enter tapped. So creatures tapped is great against aggro. Non-basic land is great against control and mid-range. So it's a little bit of it does a little bit of everything. And when it attacks, you sacrifice a creature or land. It's not a May ability, so that's the only downside here. You have to sacrifice a creature or land, but then you also draw a card. So there's a little bit of downside to it. Otherwise, it would be really overpowered. But then again, you can also benefit from possibly sacrificing creatures or lands depending on your deck build. So all in all, I think this is a really interesting card. Being able to slow down both aggro and control and mid-range makes this a very powerful, another powerful Thalia card. There's a lot of good legendary builds already, so I think Abzan Legendaries is definitely a build that can happen. Like with like Glissa at 3, Thalia and Gitrog Monster at 4, both very strong cards already. First Strike Death Touch, kind of like Glissa, it's just really, really powerful, but now it's on a 4/4 body instead of a 3/3, which is really relevant in my opinion. So I really wouldn't be surprised if we're going to see a lot of mid-range builds with Thalia and the Gitrog Monster, whether it's going to be legend-based or just a Abzan mid-range build. I think all in all, we're going to see this card a lot. It's very, very strong, and I like it a lot. Let's go to number 9. Number 9, Sunfall. 3, a white and a white for sorcery. Exile all creatures. Then incubate X, where X is the number of creatures exiled this way. So incubate is basically you create a token that has X, X meaning the amount of +1/+1 counters you put on the incubate token. It isn't a creature yet. You have to pay 2 to flip it to a creature, and then it keeps those +1/+1 counters on it. So let's say there's 5 creatures on the board. You exile all those creatures with the sorcery, and then you have an incubated token that has 5 +1/+1 counters on it. You pay 2 mana, it flips, you have a 5/5 token on the board. Overall, I think Incubate is not going to be super interesting for Constructed. I think it's too slow. There are definitely going to be some builds possible. There's a new Glissa card at 5 mana that synergizes really well with Incubate. But all in all, I think it's too slow of a mechanic for Constructed. However, for an Exile All Creatures effect at 5 mana, that is pretty solid. It makes it to where you can wipe out the board, and then if you have 2 more mana, either on your turn or the next turn you have a creature on the board to start defending yourself again. So even if you have no creatures on your board and you're just wiping out all your opponent's creatures, you still end up with a token. So it has a nice little upside for it. Exiling instead of just a destroy all is very relevant with a lot of these creatures that come back out of the graveyard. So I think all in all, Sunfall will see a lot of play. It's a very strong board wipe for 5 mana and ending up with a potential creature. Number 8, Monastery Mentor. Monastery Mentor is a 2 and a white for a creature human monk that's a 2/2 with prowess. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, create a 1/1 white monk creature token with prowess. This card is really interesting. At first, I thought this was going to be another one of the Iconoclast of the Third Path, which is for a red and a blue. You create a 1/1 anytime you cast a spell. However, that doesn't have prowess, and its tokens don't have prowess. This is going to be really interesting because this having prowess and the tokens having prowess means that it can get out of hand really quickly with those creatures. Where I find this interesting is like maybe there's not a lot of like, yes, Boros Heroic is a build that you can play this in. Jeskai spells is something, or Jeskai tokens you can build this in. However, where I think this will really shine is in just in mono white. Mono white's already pretty competitive. It's getting a lot of new tools in this set. But there's a lot in mono white that would make this trigger. Non-creature spells, so your Wedding Invitation, your Wandering Emperor, the Eternal Wanderer, your Reckoner Bankbusters, your Restoration of Iganyo. All those cards that you play in mono white, all those staples trigger Monastery Mentor. So you're going to be putting a lot of tokens on the board, and every time you cast one of those cards, all your tokens and your Monastery Mentor are getting +1/+1 until end of turn for each card you play that way. In mono white, you end up with a lot of mana, so you can possibly multi-spell per turn, really overwhelming your opponent with these tokens. So I think Monastery Mentor is going to see play in a couple different builds, but I think especially in mono white, this card is going to shine. 3 mana slot is very competitive, but I think it's going to really find a place there. Number 7, Proxa Kunaros. 3, a red, white, and a black for a legendary creature, Elder Giant Dog. It's a 6/6. It has Vigilance, Menace, and Lifelink. Whenever Proxa Kunaros enter the battlefield or attacks, you may exile 5 cards from your graveyard. When you do, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Again, another legendary creature matchup with a wall of text. I'm going to have to take a sip for this one. So I'm not going to lie, this is another one where I'm like, it sounds super interesting, super powerful. The biggest thing about it is, are you going to be able to put enough in your graveyard? If you do, this is going to be very powerful. The biggest thing right now we're seeing with reanimator decks, like obviously we all want to reanimate Atraxa. Ton of value. But the problem is you reanimate Atraxa, you refill your hand, but if your opponent, like oftentimes in these reanimator decks, you're a little on the slower side, so aggro decks are a bit of a threat. You want to get your Atraxa out, but if they have removal for Atraxa, especially against like wide decks with like a Brutal Cathar or something like that, they get your Atraxa out of the way. Great, you have your Atraxa, great, you reloaded your hand, but they're swinging for lethal. Having Proxa Kunaros on the board with Vigilance, Menace, and Lifelink on a 6/6 body, and then reanimating Atraxa, they have to get rid of both of those to be able to swing, because they can't attack through this. A 6/6 Lifelinker is really hard for aggro to deal with, especially if you have Atraxa hanging out next to it. That's why I think Proxa Kunaros is so powerful. Like, I think a lot of these Rakdos Reanimator decks are going to be splashing white for Proxa Kunaros. And honestly, most of them already have white mana in their base anyway, so they can hardcast Atraxa if they need to later on in the game. So I think Proxa Kunaros is going to, it's not going to be a 4-off, but it's definitely going to find 1 or 2 slots in some of these Rakdos/Mardu Reanimator decks. I think it's going to be very powerful alongside Atraxa, and it's going to really help against these aggro decks. And even if you don't have Atraxa in the yard yet, just putting a 6/6 Vigilance Lifelinker on the board with Menace, that makes it very easy for you to attack with and keep it back to defend at the same time. It's going to be very hard for aggro to deal with. Also against like control or the mid-range matchups, being able to have this big body on the board alongside the Atraxa, it's going to be so relevant. So I think Proxa Kunaros is really going to find some play in some of these reanimator decks and really kind of help out where currently it's lacking, where it's banking too much on the Atraxa or banking too much on having that one big creature on the board, whereas Proxa Kunaros will be able to back that up kind of as a sidekick, and they're going to have to deal with both threats real quickly. So that's why I find this card very interesting, and I'll definitely be playing it. Going to number 6. Bloodfeather Phoenix, 1 and a red for a creature Phoenix. It's a 2/2 with flying. Bloodfeather Phoenix can't block. Whenever an instant or sorcery spell you control deals damage to an opponent or battle, you may pay red. If you do, return Bloodfeather Phoenix from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains haste until end of turn. Very straightforward card, honestly. A very simple card. It is not super overpowered, but it's just very reliable, and that's why I like it, and that's why I put it in here. Obviously, right now we see the Phoenix chick a lot, which is the 1/1 flyer that can come back for 2 reds with a counter if you attack with 3 creatures. I really think that this is going to fill a good slot in mono red. I don't know if it's going to be main board right away or if it's going to be more of a sideboard card against a lot of removal. But especially after rotation, whenever we lose the bloodthirsty adversary, I think it's going to slot in there perfectly, because this is just going to be a recurring threat. Like, yeah, it doesn't have haste the first time you play it, but after that, if it keeps going to the graveyard, you shock your opponent, play 1 red, and you've got a 2/2 hasting flyer on the board. I think it's going to be very relevant, very powerful, and it's going to really help out mono red against decks that run a lot of removal, especially against black that doesn't exile as much as like white decks. Against white decks, I don't know if Bloodfeather Phoenix is really that good, but against black decks, it's definitely going to help red against the mid-range matchups. Going to number 5. Got another legendary creature matchup, Gero and Hazaret. 2 red, red, and a white for legendary creature Human God. It's a 5/4. As long as you have 1 or fewer cards in hand, Gero and Hazaret has vigilance and haste. Whenever Gero and Hazaret attacks, look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may exile a legendary creature card from among them, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Until end of turn, you may cast the exiled card without paying its mana cost. So, let's dissect this one. It's a 5/4 for 5. That by itself is not fantastic. I would like it to be a little tougher than that, maybe even just a 5/5 or a 6/5 or a 6/4, something that has a little bit more oomph. However, if you have 1 or fewer cards in hand, it has vigilance and haste. In red especially, if you're going to be playing a red aggressive deck, you typically play out your hand pretty early. So where I see this shine is kind of at the top end of an aggressive deck. And if you get to play this and it has vigilance and haste right away, and you swing with it, it triggers that ability. Looking at the top 6 cards of your library, you may exile a legendary creature card from among them. That sounds very niche. However, look at what some of the best aggressive decks are right now, are legendary-based decks. So you can slot in a Gero and Hazaret into Naya Legends, for example. Naya Legends is not right there with Esper Legends just yet, but this could put it over the top, in my opinion. Naya Legends is already really strong. Being able to have this at the top end where you play it, you swing with the 5/4 Hasting Vigilance, and then put another legendary creature card right on there at the same time without paying its mana cost. That's a lot of value for 5 mana, and that's where I think this will shine. And it's going to do it every time it attacks, so your opponent is going to have to get rid of it. Because if they don't, and you keep playing out your hand or only having, or actually, you only have to do this when it ends the battlefield. After that, you can reload your hand because it just triggers every time it attacks. Sorry. For a second there, I misunderstood the card. But anytime you attack with it, you're going to trigger that ability. And that's nuts. You're going to fill up the board really quickly. Especially in Naya Legends, you're going to have Hajar on the board. You're going to have the Plaza on the board. It's going to be very hard for your opponent to deal with this. So you play this, you're going to fill up the board, and your opponent is going to have to probably fight through several protection effects to be able to get rid of this. By then, it might be too late. So I really think this is going to be a game finisher. All right, let's go to number 4. So number 4, we have our battle. And this is the only battle that I put in here. And I'm going to tell you why. Battles, I think, are very tricky because of the way they work, because of the way they read. So first off, before I get into this card itself, the way battles work is you cast it and an opponent has to protect it. So then you have to dedicate attackers to getting points off of this battle for it to flip. Once it flips, it exiles itself and then it gets cast for no mana cost, basically. One thing that's really tricky about that is like effects like Thalia or effects that make it to where you can't cast spells from exile. Like if you have a Talia on the board and the backside is a non-creature effect, so an enchantment, sorcery, instant, whatever, Talia actually taxes it, which means that once it flips, if you have not one mana available, it fizzles. It's really awkward. So that's why I think battles, there's a time and place for them, and that's why I think this card actually fits in the top 10, because this card there's going to be times and places for it. Invasion of Fiora is 4 black and a black for a battle siege that has 4 battle points on them. I guess you call them 4 health points, whatever they're called. But basically, you have to do 4 damage to it for it to flip. When Invasion of Fiora enters the battlefield, choose one or both. Destroy all legendary creatures, destroy all non-legendary creatures. This is the first legit, all-encompassing black board wipe we currently have in Standard. Path of Exile requires a white for it to be a full board wipe. Gix's Command is not a full board wipe. This is the first board wipe we have in black, which is huge because Mono Black is a deck. But Mono Black has a hard time getting rid of a full board. This is going to help Mono Black a lot, which is great. Mono Black definitely needed more help, right? So Invasion of Fiora, the nice thing about it, though, is that it's not just for Mono Black. So it's 4 black and a black, which is easy to cast in almost every deck that runs black. It's only 2 black. Think of like Esper Legends, or Abzan Legends, or any X-Black Legends deck. If you go up against any non-Legends deck, it's a one-sided board wipe. Or if you go up against Legends decks and you don't run Legends, it's a one-sided board wipe. So you can make it choose that way. But if you just need to get the board empty, you can choose both and all creatures die. So all in all, this is just a very awesome, flexible board wipe that could be one-sided in the right deck or against the right deck. So because of that, I think this is really powerful. 6 mana is a lot for a board wipe, but under these conditions, it could be really good. If it's a one-sided board wipe, you can probably flip the battle right away because you kill your opponent's creatures, then you can right away attack this battle and do 4 damage to it possibly. So what happens if it flips? It becomes Marchesa Resolute Monarch. Marchesa Resolute Monarch is a legendary creature human noble that's a 3/6. It has menace and death touch. Whenever Marchesa Resolute Monarch attacks, remove all counters from up to 1 target permanent. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you haven't been dealt combat damage since your last turn, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. That's a lot of text on a 3/6 body, so it's very strong though because it has menace and death touch, so it's very easy to attack with it, and your opponent is going to have to dedicate multiple blockers to it if they want to stop it. Because of the death touch, you're probably going to get rid of both creatures. Because of the 6 toughness, it's actually going to be pretty hard for your opponent to get rid of this card. And when it attacks, not when it does damage, but when it attacks, you remove all counters from up to 1 target permanent. Basically, what this says is when you attack with this, you kill a planeswalker. Or when you attack with this, you flip a battle. That's super, super interesting and very relevant against mid-range and control decks, or if you run battles yourself. But even if you go against aggro decks, like maybe like Gruul counters, you can completely deplete a creature of all their counters. That's very relevant too. Makes it a lot safer to attack. Or you can just keep this back as a 3/6 Death Toucher and make it hard for your opponent to attack into, because if you didn't get any combat damage since your last turn, you draw a card and you lose 1 life, which is also a very relevant effect, especially in black where you have Shouldered, which is kind of like a Monarch ability, which is really cool. One-sided Monarch that your opponent can't steal from you. So all in all, this card is incredibly powerful, and I think there's going to be a lot of good applications for this card. And I think that's what makes this battle really relevant and playable, and makes it the one battle that I was comfortable putting in this top 10, because it has a really strong, flexible front side and a really strong backside. And it's not hard to flip this battle. So all in all, I think this is a really interesting card, and I will definitely be playing with this. All right, we've gotten to the top 3. And the funny thing about the top 3 is that they're all in the same colors, which is kind of weird. But let's just go ahead and jump into it. Number 3, we have an uncommon in Kenrust Pell Spear. It's a 1 and a red for a creature jackal warrior. It has 2/2, trample, and prowess. And it has for 3 and a red Phyrexian mana, blue Phyrexian mana, transform Kenrust Pell Spear. Activate only as a sorcery. So you can pay it for 3 and 2 life, or for 3 and a blue. And it transforms. But let's stay on this side first. So a 2 mana 2/2 with trample and prowess is already pretty good. Like, that doesn't have haste makes it a little awkward in red because you like all your creatures early to have haste to start doing damage quickly. However, it's still pretty powerful. Like with the trample effect and the prowess, um, once you start casting spells, it can start like really doing quite a bit of damage. But that's not why I put this at the top three. Like, I think that's already playable. But once you play this and you do damage with it, or you get to 3 mana, or a little later in the game if you want, if you need it to be beefier, that's when you flip it, and that's when it gets really nuts. For Gitaxian Spellstalker, so it's a creature Phyrexian Jackal, and it's a 3/3. It has Trample, Ward 2, Prowess, Prowess. So what does that mean? So it has 2 sets of prowesses on it, meaning that for every spell you cast that's non-creature, it triggers prowess twice. So let's say you lightning strike your opponent's face. This triggers prowess twice, so now it's a 5/5 trampler with Ward 2. The Ward 2 is very relevant against control and mid-range decks because they're going to want to kill this thing. Problem is that the Kenrust spell still dies to cut down. That is really the biggest downside of this card. It dies to pretty much every removal spell. But if you can flip this and you get the Gitaxian Spellstalker on the board, you're going to do a lot of damage quickly with this card, and that makes it so powerful. I'm very leery on the transform effects because they're transform as a sorcery. You put mana into it, you put life into it, and then it dies to removal before it flips. That's very, very dangerous. Um, but I was willing to put this card in the top three because of the amount of damage it can do, and I really think that this is going to slot in really well in mono red, especially after rotation. Um, but I think there might be a spot for it now, depending on how the meta will shape. Um, it's just very, very strong. I think it'll be really good against other creature decks, especially. Um, but it's also like against decks that run a lot of removal, I would probably board this out. But against decks that don't run a lot of removal, this is gonna get out of hand quickly and really do a ton of damage. That's why I put it in the top three. So let's go down to number two. Number two, I have Into the Fire. Into the Fire is 2 and a red for sorcery. Choose one. Into the Fire deals 2 damage to each creature, planeswalker, and battle. Or put any number of cards from your hand on the bottom of your library, then draw that many cards plus 1. So this is a very flexible board wipe. 2 damage to each creature, planeswalker, and battle. That's pretty interesting in case you run the battle. So like if you are in Rakdos and you run that Invasion of Fiora, being able to do 2 damage to it is pretty relevant while you're also hurting creatures and planeswalkers. So if your opponent is reloading the board after you just board wipe them with Into the Fiora, Into the Fire or Invasion of Fiora, Into the Fire can be a really interesting way to get rid of them. And his creatures, planeswalkers, and battles is interesting. But what I really like about it is the flexibility is that if you don't have the board wipe side, you can cycle cards from your hand through your library and draw those cards plus 1. So you're always ahead. So it's basically an extra, you draw an extra card, which is fantastic. I like this better than Brotherhood's End. And Brotherhood's End sees a ton of play. I think Brotherhood's End is interesting if your opponent runs more artifacts, like Reckoner Bankbusters, Treasures, especially against Anvil, you want Brotherhood's End. But in pretty much any other scenario, I'm going to want Into the Fire, because Into the Fire still hits all the relevant targets. Think of all your soldiers decks. Soldier decks, almost all of them have toughness 2. The only one that it wouldn't hit is the Skyfire Captain, I think is his name, which is relevant. That's a really powerful target, don't get me wrong. But it hits pretty much everything else. It hits your Blood Tithe Harvester, it hits your Tenacious Underdog, it hits your Goblin token from Fable, it hits Kiki Jiki. It hits all those that are really dangerous that you're wanting to get rid of. So it's a safe board wipe against all of those. It hits pretty much everything that's in mono red except for Thundering Raiju. So again, very good board wipe against all those decks. You don't need the 3 damage. 2 damage is often enough. And then to be able to have the flexibility to cycle it for a bunch of card draw in case you don't necessarily need the board wipe makes it so much better because often Brotherhood's End ends up being a dead card that you cycle away with Fable of Kikijiki. I'd rather have Into the Fire in those cases. So I think Into the Fire, I think a lot of people are going to feel the same way I do, and I'm going to think that this will see more play than Brotherhood's End, which says a lot about the card. So I think this is definitely one of the best cards in the set. That's why I put it at 2. So what do I think is the best card in the set? It's actually a little bit of a greedy card, I'm not going to lie, but it's super powerful. If it resolves and you get to cast spells with it, Chandras Beacon is going to be lit, no pun intended. For a red and a red for legendary planeswalker Chandra. It comes in with 5 loyalty. It has a passive effect. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you copy it. You may choose new targets for the copy. This ability triggers only once each turn. +2 loyalty. Add 2 mana in any combination of colors. +1 loyalty. Exile the top 5 cards of your library until the end of your next turn. You may cast an instant or sorcery from among those exiled cards. And at -X, Chandras Beacon deals X damage to each of up to 2 targets. This card is nuts. 6 mana is not that bad in the decks that this is going to go into. This can possibly go into like at the top end of maybe a Grixis mid-range or Grixis control deck, or it's going to go at the top end of a Rakdos mid-range or control deck. And it's going to be really strong in those decks because being able to copy one spell each turn is nuts in those decks. Just think of Invoke Despair. You're going to cast an Invoke Despair, and you're going to hit. It's going to copy itself. So 2 Invoke Despairs for the price of 1. Mana cost is not an issue because you have the +2 ability. But even then, exiling the top 5 cards of your library, top 5, that's a lot. And that's going to be a plus loyalty ability, not a minus. So you're going to still benefit from digging into your library to look for those spells. So there's a really solid chance you're going to be able to find some of these cards that are going to make a lot of impact. Other cards that are going to start being interesting with this is like the Alchemist Gambit, I think it's called, the one where you take an extra turn. By itself, for 7 mana, it's not great. But with this, you're going to be able to cast it a lot easier because of the +2 ability. You're going to take 2 extra turns. So you cast it, you take 2 extra turns, and Chandra will just completely take over the game because you take your 2 extra turns. Maybe after that, you find your Invoke Despair. You're just going to start cleaning up. Or even just burn down the house. Like you play your burn down the house and you create 6 devils. Not fantastic, but it's still really powerful. Like spells that are kind of like, should I really run that? Become really powerful with Chandras Beacon. So 5 loyalty is also really powerful. Like this is not easy to get rid of. Um, like you're gonna have to have direct removal for it, otherwise it's gonna be very hard to deal with. Especially because it can get rid of 2 targets. I like that part a lot too, where it's not typically planeswalkers have a something that can get rid of 1 creature. Being able to use the minus ability to get rid of possibly 2 targets, that is really interesting. But what's also nice is that it's 2 targets, not 2 creatures. You'll probably use this for creatures if you just cast it and you want to make sure that it survives. Or you cast this, you do your +2, and you can use a removal spell. It'll copy itself and you can get rid of 2 creatures that way. So there's a couple different ways you can do it depending on what you have in your hand. Well, what's nice about it is, like, let's say you rack up the loyalty here, you can deal X damage to each of up to 2 targets. Could also be opponent's face. So let's say you cast this, you +2, you cast a removal spell from hand, get rid of 2 creatures, make sure Chandra survives the next turn, possibly, if they don't have removal. And then the next turn, if you don't need Chandra anymore, maybe you cast your Invoke Despair, it copies, it hits your opponent for a lot, and then after that, you know what, I'm just going to minus Chandra to do -7 face. That's pretty nuts. Like Chandra is very powerful. Now, granted, I understand I just kind of talk Disneyland style, like, hey, everything needs to fall into place. But you and I both know that Rakdos and Grixis are very good at card selection. They're very good at getting the cards when they want them and what cards they need. And this card is going to make that go over the top. So Rakdos, Grixis, Chandra is going to be a powerhouse. So very, very good card. Definitely keep an eye out for it. So that's the end of that. Like I said before, this set has a lot going on with it, so please let me know in the comments if there are things that you agree with, disagree with. What card are you missing? What card do you think I shouldn't have in this top 10? Other than that, I hope you enjoyed this. Make sure to like, subscribe. I got the dates up here for the paper pre-release and the arena release. I'm really excited about this set. It looks really cool. Overall, it's a very nice power level, in my opinion, with something really good. Most of it just mid. I think it'll be a lot of fun. So thanks for watching.